This is going to be the first lecture talking about tissue types, and it will set us up for the four main tissue types. And then we'll start talking about epithelial tissue, and then the rest of the videos will finish out epithelial tissue as well as the other tissue types. So let's start. When we talk about tissues, what we're talking about is a, a collection of specialized cells, and they're going to be working together for a specific function. So if you think about some examples of this, we have muscle tissue where the individual muscle cells are specialized for contraction, but we need the entire tissue where you have lots and lots of muscle cells working together in order for the entire tissue to contract. When we're talking about humans, we have four main tissue types, which are sometimes also called the four primary tissue types, and those are going to be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And if you think about each of those tissue types, they are going to have some characteristics that kind of set them apart from the other types. So if we look at epithelial tissue is always going to be covering or lining skin or living. Skin is probably the best example of epithelial tissue. It's covering the outside of the body and helping to protect it there. If you think about internal organs that have a free space, those will be lined with epithelial tissue. So the lining of the lungs where air goes, or the lining of the stomach where food's going to be, or the lining of the bladder where urine would be, that's all going to have epithelial tissue on the inside there. So its main function in life is going to be protection. The epithelial tissue in your skin is protecting everything else in your body from the outside elements, but the same thing goes for the inside. The lining of your stomach is protecting the rest of your organs from stomach acid that would be in there, or air and bacteria from just going directly into your body. So epithelial tissue is always going to be that barrier. I'm going to skip over connective tissue for the moment, and then if we talk about muscle tissue is going to be specialized for contraction. So its job is going to be moving things. And when we say things, this could be body parts like your biceps and your triceps and your quads. Those are going to move arms and legs and that type of body part. That type of muscle tissue is called skeletal muscle tissue, and we'll talk more about that in the muscle tissue lecture. We also have muscle tissue in your heart, so that's going to be moving things, but it's moving blood. So your heart has cardiac muscle tissue, and that's going to contract and pump the blood throughout the circulatory system. And then the third type of muscle tissue we have is called smooth muscle tissue, and that's going to move things, I'm just going to say move things through organs. So if you think about food getting pushed through your stomach and your intestines, that excuse me, that's smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue in your bladder contracts to squeeze the urine out of your bladder. Smooth muscle tissue in the uterus contracts to squeeze a baby out of the uterus. So whenever we're moving things within the body, that's going to be smooth muscle tissue. The last one there, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is going to be specialized to send electrical signals within the body. And the nervous system is one of the internal communication systems within the body. So sending these electrical signals within the body is going to be a way that your body has to communicate with other parts of the body. So if your brain wants to tell your hand to move, that's done with the nervous system. Or if your foot needs to tell your brain that you stepped on something sharp, that's going to be done with the nervous system. And the way that the nervous system does that is by sending electrical impulses in those different cells. So that's epithelial, muscle, and nervous. The fourth one there is connective tissue. Connective tissue is a very diverse group. It's kind of like the protist of tissue types, because we're going to see a lot of different things in here. When we look at its characteristics, it connects things in the body. And sometimes that connection is physical. We'll see things like tendons and ligaments in this category. So they are physically connecting bones to bones or muscle tissue to bones. But then we also see things like blood is a connective tissue. And that doesn't really hold things together, but it does connect different organs of the body by bringing oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the tissue. So it does kind of a functional connection, if not a physical connection there. The other definition that we're going to see along with connective tissue is specialized cells in what's called the matrix. And this is not like computer Keanu Reeves matrix. The matrix here is kind of a new term for us, but matrix is going to be the non-living part of the tissue. So it's going to be outside of the cells. And the other tissue types, epithelial, muscle, and nervous, we don't talk about matrix because the tissues are pretty much just the cells. But in connective tissue, a lot of times we'll have a very prominent part of the tissue that's not the cells. For example, if you look at bone tissue, there are living cells in bone tissue. They're called osteocytes. But the majority of that tissue is not cells. It is calcium phosphate crystals and protein fibers, collagen fibers, that are making up the majority of that tissue. And those non-living parts, the protein and the calcium phosphate crystals, that's the matrix. So matrix is going to be a term that we're going to need to know for connective tissue, and we'll talk more about that. So let's make sure we have all of these lined up. This would be our nervous tissue type. This would be our muscle tissue type, connective, and then epithelial. And this is going to be really important when we get to the lab because we're going to look at a lot of these examples. And first question is going to be which of the four main tissue types it is. So epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. I would suggest write that down on a note card and stick it somewhere where you're going to see it like 20 times a day. And then maybe it will stick in your head. So those are our four main tissue types. And now we're going to talk a bit about epithelial tissue. So let's start with a clean slate here. Epithelial tissue, we just mentioned, is going to have the hallmark, let's make that big, hallmark characteristic of covering and lining things. Why do I keep writing living? So this is going to be our main one for protection. It's going to help to protect internal organs from the outside. It's also going to help protect inside organs from inside things like stomach acid. We don't need that leaking all over your abdominal cavity. So lots of protection going on with epithelial tissue. When we talk about epithelial tissue, we have two kind of characteristics that we use. Epithelial tissue, if you like organized things, epithelial tissue naming is going to be right up your alley. So let's get some different colors going on here. One of the things that we're going to look at in epithelial tissue is going to be the number of cell layers. And our options here are going to be one layer, which we call simple tissue type, or you can have more than one, which is going to be the term stratified. And then we do have one other option that is a little bit confusing, but it's possible that you have one layer that looks like many. And that is what we call pseudostratified. So if you remember, pseudo means fake or false. So pseudostratified means it's faked stratified. It's false stratified. It looks like it's stratified, but it's not actually. So those are going to be our options. You can have one layer that we call simple epithelial tissue. You can have more than one layer. We would call that stratified. Or you can have one layer that actually looks like many, and that would be our pseudostratified tissue type. So those are going to be one set of terms we need to know: simple stratified and pseudostratified. The other term that we use for epithelial tissue is going to be based off of cell shape. And our options here are going to be squamous, which is probably the weirdest of them. Squamous literally means scale-like. But when we say scale, we mean like a fish scale. So it's kind of a very flat cell with an irregular shape. Probably the best way to describe it, if you're looking from the top of it, would be a very flat fried egg, because they'll have a nucleus in them. So they're very flat cells, but they have an irregular shape. They're not directly circle shaped. So that would be the squamous. That's kind of the hardest of the bunch. We also have cuboidal. So that's a D. Which is what it sounds like. That's going to be cube-like shaped. So those cells are roughly as wide as they are tall as they are long. They're not going to be perfectly cube, but cube-ish in the body. And then our other option is columnar, which should make you think of columns. So this is going to be column-like. So they're going to look like rectangles that are kind of standing up on end. And what we're going to do when we name epithelial tissue is we're going to take one word from each of these options. So if we had a simple cuboidal epithelial tissue type, that would mean that we had one layer of cube-shaped cells. If we had a stratified squamous tissue type, that means we would have multiple layers of squamous cells. I should say stratified technically means anything more than one. So there are tissue types that have 2 or 3 layers of cells. The ones that we're going to see in this lecture and in lab, we're talking usually like 30 or plus layers of cells, so it's a lot of layers. Or we could have pseudostratified columnar, so column-shaped cells that look like mini layers even though they're not. We'll talk about how that happens. We're not going to get every combination here. So the ones that we are going to focus on, we're going to see simple for all versions. So we'll see simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. We're going to look at just stratified squamous and then just pseudostratified columnar. If you've taken a human A&P class at some point, you will notice that we are skipping over some of these. There are more epithelial tissues types than what we're going to talk about, but those are going to be the 5 that we are going to get a little bit further in detail about. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this lecture, and then in the next one we will start talking about the different epithelial tissue types and where we would find them.